You're listening to
Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington. Way below acceptable. Way below acceptable.
On this week's episode.
And so what happened was we were not clear enough that when that Brown versus Board of Education decision was enacted, yeah, we'll let your kids come to school. But you know what we did not do was peel back the layers of all of those things.
Way below acceptable.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sticky Note Conversations. I am your host, creator, executive producer, Erika Washington. And today's conversation is going to be amazing. I'm already sure. I would like to introduce you to a very old friend of mine that I have known for more years than I'm going to actually sit here on my fingers and try to count. His name is Kwame Simmons Sr., and he is the founder and lead facilitator of the Simmons Advantage. It's a consulting firm that partners to provide organizational change, strategy, leadership development, and workforce development with an emphasis on people with disabilities. But before that, he spent over 20 years as an educator, revolutionizing urban schools, and has received national recognition from the Washington Post, U.S. Department of Education, as well as the BET honors. He is also a father and a husband to one of my most favorite people in the world. And I am really excited to start this conversation with my friend, the closest to a brother-in-law that I will ever have, as I am only child. Please welcome my friend, Kwame Simmons.
Yes. What up, E?
How are you?
I am well, ma'am. I am well. I cannot complain. I'm excited. Super excited.
I'm excited too. I am excited too. Like, you are an extremely successful Black man who has spent what I know of you in the 20-ish years, I feels like that I've known you, really concentrating on making the next generations better. You've spent a lot of time instilling values, not only into your children, but into other folks' children and into the school system to change the trajectory of folks who may not have that opportunity otherwise. And so I was saying before we got started that I don't know that we've actually sat down and had like a real conversation about some of these things. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the state of the world today, the state of education, and how we as a community do better. So I want to start with asking you, like, I've done this whole introduction, which is great, of who you are, but how do you see yourself? How do you show up in the world? And what do you want people to notice about you first?
That's a good question. I think where I try to show up is authentically Black. I think because my experience growing up in the United States, race is such a pivotal role, particularly if you are non-white and particularly not a white male. But I see it as a badge of honor. And so I want people to see that. I want them to have to reconcile their feelings if they aren't a person of color and be uncomfortable to understand, wow, there is a level of intellect that I just didn't know. Like, I see the news and I see all of these reports around people of color, but wait a minute, this is something that I haven't experienced, and to be uncomfortable and have to reconcile that level of discomfort.
So take me back to the early days. What made you decide to want to get involved in education?
I think I always knew, even going back to high school, when I was in high school, I thought I wanted to be a doctor. But I wanted to help people. I always felt like I wanted to help people. I have a family of people who have been service-oriented. My father, my grandfather, my brothers have always served in roles and professions that provide service. And so that's what I thought I wanted to do. And then I got to college, to the greatest university in the land, which is the Hampton University, and ran into organic chemistry. And that's when I realized that there was a level of humility that I had to accept. that being a doctor was no longer going to be in my future because that was by far the most difficult subject I'd ever had. And a good friend of mine from Indianapolis, Lloyd Bryant, asked me to come to one of his classes, and he was a history major. And when I walked into that class, it probably wasn't 20 minutes that I knew. And I had never considered changing my major, even with all of the struggles I was having in those classes. But it wasn't until I got in there that I realized that this is actually a possibility to change. Like, this is actually something that I really enjoy. And so I thought and had accepted that college was supposed to just be a brutal process. But being in there, it became fun. So then after I graduated, I actually went and worked at the NAACP. I was the National Youth and College Coordinator. I helped to organize things. And during this time, the NAACP was really front and center politically because they were leading the nonviolent protests in the South behind taking down the state capitol structures. And so this is during that time when it was like, addressing state capitol flags and some of the statues, all of that stuff being taken down. And I think at the time it might have been South Carolina that was the biggest issue. After that, I had a really good friend, may she rest in peace, Bridget Ely. Just before I was graduating, I was able to be a paraprofessional with her. So I was able to sit inside those classes. And that's when I got the first chance to really interact with school, like a K-12 experience after being in college. And in Virginia, in order to, if you've been suspended or had any kind of extended or even short stay with the correctional facility, you had to go through what's called like a temporary location that like almost like an alternative setting. And they had to recommend that you were ready to return to the school. And so I worked at that alternative center. And I immediately realized it was, dominated by Black and brown children in there. What I thought was isolated there has now become something that is pretty prevalent across schools. And that's how teachers and how educators see Black and brown people and accept or deny their culture. And based upon those judgments, make decisions about how they think they should experience their education. And that really sparked something in me. But during this time, I wasn't completely happy at the NAACP. And so I had a really short stint there and left to work for the Gore Lieberman campaign. I was on the advance team and served as the crowd lead. And so that role was to go into each city before the vice president got there and talk about organizing and gathering people to attend his rallies and events. And then unfortunately, after the infamous
hanging chads.
Right. I was counting chads. I was actually in Tallahassee. So people were in Broward and Miami-Dade, but I was in Tallahassee. And then after about 3 months, they were like, yeah, it's a wrap. And then that was it. And so I came back, talked to Bridget. Bridget talked to some people and I became a teacher. And it was probably either December 2000 or January 2001 is I was in there and it was game time. We have not looked back since.
That's so funny. I think Gore was my first presidential election that I ever voted in. That was the first one that I was old enough to vote in. And I remember it distinctly and having a lot of confusion because I had no idea like what was going on. And although we still had a lot of news sources in 2000 or whatever, it wasn't the same as it is now in trying to understand like what is even happening and why the election went the way it went. But I want to go back to something you said. You said when you were in college and you wanted to be a doctor or you had figured that's what you were going to, your major, and you said you didn't think you could change your mind. Talk to me a little bit about why you thought you didn't think you had an option to change your mind, to do something different.
Because I'm the fourth of 5 boys and pretty much grew up with a single father. Our mothers were involved, but all of us stayed with our dad. And I was able to see the struggles of my brothers before me and what was happening when they went to school. And so I just internalized, if you can get in, don't cause any problems and definitely don't do anything that's going to cost anymore. And I would just hear these stories of people who just relentlessly kept changing their majors and how that would delay them from graduating, and they'd have to keep coming back additional semesters. I was like, yeah, no, that's not an option. And so when I was able to make that transition, it was a calculated decision because I might have only been a few classes out because I didn't realize that I had actually taken a couple of history classes as electives. And so that helped me. And so when it was time to make the transition, it wasn't too difficult. And the other thing is that many of the history courses, except the ones that were like senior level, were offered multiple times, which was a little bit different than the molecular biology major, which is what I would have been, because there were only certain teachers and only certain times that those courses would have been offered. And so you had a bunch of courses that were like, only spring. And so if you didn't take it when it was offered, or if you didn't do well, that really put you in a bind.
Yeah, it just makes me think about privilege, the privilege that even that my children get that I didn't have in certain ways. And this is actually a conversation that I had with my therapist not too long ago about frustrations of different decisions that our young adult children are making, and you're trying to guide them certain ways, and them, or I should say me, feeling a little bit like they're not taking things as seriously. And one thing that she reminded me of is that, the foundation that I have laid, even somewhat unintentionally, is that they have the opportunity to try things and fail. And they're not as stressed and concerned about that pressure that I think sort of you talked about. What's the added cost going to be? Or is this going to be more of a hindrance on parents or what have you? And although I do think that they are concerned about finances because they need to know like money don't grow on trees, but they have a different sense of life. They're not raised the way I was raised, which is obviously on purpose also, because I want them to have more opportunities and do things better. But I also think, like I said, unintentionally have given them space to experiment some. And it's so different from me that I don't know what to do with watching that experimentation because I have never had an opportunity to do that. It was, you got to do what you got to do. And I need to try to get it right the first time because I also had my children very young. And so, it's a privilege that they have that I want them to have, but I also looking at it from this angle, it's hard to figure out in my head because I'm still putting myself in it, and putting myself in it is, you're doing too much.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a powerful reflection. I think I also grapple with that, as a father, but I would add another layer to that. Playing sports my whole life, and then where I rank in terms of my sibling ranking, I see the world a certain way and the environment in which I grew up. And so playing sports bred a level of competitiveness. Being the fourth bred a level of competitiveness because I just came into the world fighting, elbowing and pushing around, trying to get my space. And then the neighborhood in which I grew up in was an environment that bred aggression. I try to communicate that failure is okay, but I guess where I struggle is if you're putting in the effort though, right? I want to see effort being provided because I don't want to say, oh, it didn't go well, but you also didn't try, right? So now it's not that it just didn't go well. It failed because you never put any effort into it. And so I think that's something that is a trigger for me. I want to see you work hard because you don't need anybody to help you with that. That's in you. That's a level of integrity to what you said you wanted to do. And so see it through, with some pride.
So tell me about your experience, your first few years teaching. What was that like for you? Were you surprised at the experience? And I guess I should also ask you, what grades were you concentrating on?
So when I first started, my initial experience was at the alternative school in Newport News, Virginia. That was like high school age, which I thought was good. The behaviors emulated the kinds of behaviors of kids that I had grown up with. And so I felt like I understood them in ways that didn't intimidate me, which I think allowed the beginning of what I now know to be relationship building, acknowledgement of individuals because they may be different. doesn't mean it's disagreeable. But after that, when I got back to Detroit, I was a substitute teacher for kindergarten. I knew then that kindergartners were synonymous to the first version of Gremlins, right? And it was actually when Strike came, like they were there and it was like, just the one, little one was cute because that's your kid. But when they start to multiply, it is,
It's chaos.
oh my goodness, it's the most difficult job, I think, in K-12. Like you have to be a very, very special person. And I always share the stories. This young man's name was Jeremy. It had taken me 2 weeks and I had finally gotten the kids to kind of put their heads down and do some semblance of a nap or quiet time after lunch. I just couldn't get it figured out. And so this is early 2000. And so they're sitting there and I'll never forget. I look over at the teaching assistant and I was like, I got it. She was like, you did very good, such. And we just sitting there. So I'm like tiptoeing over to the desk and I hear Jeremy say, from the window. And I look around and before I could say Jeremy, all the rest of the kids say,
to the wall.
And they was all up. They all dancing. They in the middle of the floor.
I'm screaming. Come on, the 99 and the 2000s.
Listen, I just put my hands on, and I look over to the assistant. Her face is wet. She is laughing she is almost exhausted. But it was in that moment that I realized, human beings aren't designed to be on such a regimented schedule because you got to build a rapport. You got to build a rhythm to get them there. And I was young, didn't have any children at the time. And so this was all a huge learning moment, but I never forgot that. And so what I did was stop taking myself so serious that these are kids. If they don't want to go to sleep, then they don't have to go to sleep. And I'm spending more time trying to push them down and to be quiet than to try and lean into what are some other ways to just have them relax. Because what's the real goal here? Is it for them to be asleep or is it for them to transition like a brain activity? And so it took a while for me to realize that, but I knew in that moment, this isn't it. We trying to put a square peg in a round hole. That's not going to work. So that was the only semester. Thankfully, I was transitioned out of there. I was a long-term sub there. And then I went up to fourth grade. After that, I did fifth grade. And after that, I had been middle school until I became an administrator.
Kindergartners will humble you.
Oh, I'm telling you.
The truth serum that comes out of them. But also, I think it's dope because honestly, I don't know that I've ever seen a Black male kindergarten teacher. And I think what a Black male kindergarten teacher could do and how they can shape a young one's life is really important. So I appreciate, even if it was only one semester, I'm sure you got some lifelong memories those children have of you.
Yes, that was interesting. But I think it's important because you brought that up. Black males make up 1.4% of the educator workforce. And so it's really important that there is representation because it matters. It matters in terms of interpretation. It matters in terms of ambition because proximity to what you dream about is critically important. And so that's what I try to model, is someone that is not of a mold that's defined by someone else besides us. And so I want our Black kids to see a person that is dressed up. So as an example, we have a client that I go and see frequently, and one of the kids said, hey, can I ask you a question? I said, what's up? He said, why are you always wearing this suit? You going to a funeral every time? Seems like every time I see you, you got the suit on. So you must be going to a funeral or to court. And so it took a second for me to understand that that's his experience, right? That he might be experiencing when males that are around him are doing that. I said, nah, I own a company that, comes here and helps support your school. It was just like a whole paradigm explosion for him to even have that conversation. And so that was just a moment for me to realize no, it's bigger than that. And so that representation matters.
So what made you transition from the classroom into administration?
I want to answer that in a couple of ways. And the short response was money. There was an opportunity to be promoted. There was a significant difference in pay. But I think what really motivated me was the belief that the organization had in me. They saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. I had never really considered it. I thought I was in a sweet spot. I was teaching. I was really getting a good rhythm for how to teach. I was coaching basketball, and I had my summers off. I was like, I am living my best life. And what I quickly realized was really, in order to be good, especially in your early years of teaching, you should never have summers off, that you should be working on your craft, because in order to really be a master teacher, which was my desire, you need 10,000 hours of teaching the same grade and the same subject. And so if you just teach during the school year, that'll be 5 to 7 years. And so I said, I just need more contact hours. So I need to either be teaching during the school, I need to be teaching after school, tutoring groups, and I definitely need to be teaching summer school. And so that became my mission, was to teach more. I think that commitment must have elevated me in the eyes of my supervisors to think that was something I would be successful doing.
Did you worry about if you would still be able to make a difference in students' lives without being an actual teacher or facilitator in a classroom on a daily basis?
I was actually more excited because it gave me an opportunity to see all the kids. Like I had the flexibility and the authority to go into all the classes. And I actually asked to be over the cafeteria. And so during the lunch program, that allowed me to see all the kids every single day. And so one of the things that did for me was I was able to learn all the kids' names. And so in a school with, 600 kids, I knew every single one of them. And so being able to do that really created a bond between me, the students, and the parents. And so one of the things that I also did was made sure I led the arrival and dismissal. And so I would be outside, rain, hail, sleet, or snow. So I would see the parents as they're dropping them off and speak to the kids. And so that really created a really tight bond between the school and between the school students and parents.
So when you became an administrator and decided that you could help more folks that way, how did you get into the space of specifically working with like turnaround schools? What does it mean to turn a school around?
Yeah, so that's a term that was coined around the George Bush administration with the adoption of No Child Left Behind legislation. And so what happened was they wanted to begin ranking schools by performance. And so if your school was to be considered in the bottom 10%, then these were schools that states needed to identify as schools that needed improvement or turnaround. And so what happened, they started to allocate funding like school improvement grant funding. And you started to see language in there that talked about school turnaround, certain categories that needed to improve for this school to have a successful transformation. What I knew before that term was coined was that I wanted to work with Black children. I wanted to be in places where they didn't see my face, where they didn't know about going to Black colleges. They didn't know about, and what's interesting, I was really inspired by like Dwayne Wayne, like looking at different world, and what we were able to grow up seeing as kids was very powerful. Because again, it's talking about all of these young Black kids in college and what they're grappling with and how they problem solve, how they treat each other. And so to have producers on a show like that ensure that the imagery that we saw and how they interacted was so positive that I knew I was going to a Black college. And so it created a sense of commitment and desire in me to be able to come back and say, hey, look, you deserve to understand and see through my experiences what I had there, and you should be able to share that. And so I always wanted all the schools to have an environment and a culture of acceptance, motivation, excitement, experience, because being from Detroit, going to Hampton, that's 12 hours away. I'm all the way in Virginia. That's a completely different space. And so the experience to be able to interact and just see something so different, I thought was powerful. And so one of the things that I was able to do with that was we had a basketball team. So we would, we got a charter bus and we would do we call it like a friendship game where we would play a school that was like an hour, 2 hours away. That's stuff that you typically do in college, right? Maybe in a really good high school. But to be in the 5th and 6th grade, 7th grade, and you on a charter bus just to go hoop that was completely unheard of. And then I remember we had a French teacher who was struggling to get the students to engage. So she was asking me questions around what could she do? And I said, maybe we, take them to some French restaurants. But I started looking up. I was like, yeah, French cuisine isn't, the best. Right. So we could think of some other things. And so when I was a teacher, I was thinking about the kids going on these tours out of the country. And so I had this pamphlet from EF Tours and I shared it with her. I said, well, why don't we think about, kids who do really well in the class can be nominated to go to Paris? And she was like, where will we get the money? I said, you're doing too much. I said, do you want to do it or not? We'll figure out the rest. We shared that and I helped her. We created a proposal. We did a proposal to the board and the board approved funding to do it. We took 13 kids to Paris in 2005. And so what was powerful about that was the first time that kids got passports. Obviously, the first time that they were, out of the country. And I think it showed them that adults can care for them in ways that they couldn't even dream of. That we were thinking about doing something for them that they had never, ever even considered. And so just sitting there watching them walk through the Louvre, getting crate, right? It was just like a mind-blowing experience. And just watching them get on an airplane that had more than one door opening, right? They were like, what is going on? Like, where they're going to fall off? This is the door. I said, no, it's two. And so just seeing that in them, these kids, it was just like, it was powerful.
How did the parents react to this? I wonder, was there any pushback? Were they nervous about even the idea of letting their children go off and do more? And I ask, knowing parents who didn't let their children do certain things because they had never done it, and it was so far out of their realm to even think about going to Australia or anywhere else outside of the country, that they end up limiting their children in this way. Did you run across that at all?
Yeah, we did. We had some parents, but it was just a couple who were like, yeah, that's too much, because the kids were in the 7th grade at the time. And so a couple of parents were like, yeah, that's not it. What I think eased a lot of their tension was who would be going. And so obviously I said that I would go. I was very active as the basketball coach, the athletic director. And so they saw me everywhere. And so if there was a person that they were like, okay, I feel comfortable because of the proximity, like how close I was to them, I think that assured them. So I think that was the first one. But then we also opened it up for 2 parents. If 2 parents wanted to go, we eventually got one. And we got a mom to come. And so I was excited about that because now we had another female person that would be there. And then eventually my principal stepped up and came because I was the assistant principal, athletic director at the time. And so now we had 3 women because the teacher was a woman. So we had the 3 women, myself. We had a nice balanced team. And I think the amount of time that we had I think we might have said we were going to do it in October and eventually went in April. So that the amount of time that we had in between to meet and talk to the parents, get their passports, I think over time, it started to reduce their anxiety because they're like, oh, okay, well, you could ask all the questions. They could do their research. They could do all the things. They could look up the company. We were obviously in a place at that time. There was no real political unrest in Europe. So they were good. I think I probably was more nervous. I was like, I'm so ambitious. I was like, yeah, this is good. I was like, wait a minute, this is really happening. I got to be responsible for 13 kids.
Yeah, because you had this big idea and you was like, don't worry about all that. Let's just figure it out. And then you get to it and you're like, oh, shoot, we actually about to do this. And you're in charge to a certain degree and responsible for these children, not only just for their safety, but also that they actually have a good time and get what they need to out of the trip, because that's a weight to carry.
Yes. But, I think any successful person can identify people along their journey that pull them to and through a place that they didn't even know they needed to be pulled through. And that's what, going to Hampton was for me. I always say it was the place where I transformed from a boy to a man. And I just felt if education is about enlightenment, sharing information, providing competence and capacity building, like our job is to help them see their wildest dreams. And so to research and, see these things come true, it was over. Like when that happened, I think the school began to elevate in a way because people started to say, well, wait a minute. Well, we can do anything here. If you start hearing kids say that, I mean, I just feel like you have really hit an apex. And so right after that, once I saw we did that, we instituted the very first HBCU college tour for eighth graders. That became their eighth grade trip. Because I was like, I want you to be able to be exposed to where the universities are that graduate the most African Americans every single year. And so being in Michigan, we just didn't have that proximity. We had, Central State and Wilberforce, but that's just two. So to be able to, one, go out and see other states, see multiple colleges, experience the culture, talk to other kids that were a good distance away from them, 5, 6 years older. So when they got to high school and they start thinking about what they're going to do, they've already had that visual around what to adjust to when they go to their local college tours, when they get some of these college fairs, they've actually been there. Because I felt that was synonymous to when you're in a class, if you're in a focus group and someone says, oh, this is what it's like in Italy. And we're just reading something about Italy. And then you say, oh, no, this is how you actually get a taxi, or this is how you get from the airport to this location, or these are the resources that are there if you're international. See, when you put your foot down there, it's a different experience in how you share that. So I felt like that was really important for them to be thinking, if you're going to make this investment and your family is going to make this investment for you in college, I want to say by the time you leave me, we've given you everything that we could for you to make one of the biggest decisions that you make in your life to that point.
You're listening to
Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington.
How important is it for people to leave their home space, their home state, or what have you, to go off to college? Do you think that really changes someone's dynamic?
I think each kid is different. I think every person, I would highly suggest before they start growing a family or getting too deep into their career, live somewhere besides where they grew up, because it will help to influence how they see where they grew up. Because it was me leaving and going to Hampton when I realized there were places that didn't have sirens at night, right? I didn't hear the police sirens coming up. I didn't hear gunshots. I didn't hear loud music coming up and down. But I didn't realize I was hearing that every day. I knew about them gunshots because I could tell how close it was, depending on what I heard. And I could tell the difference between a gunshot and fireworks. But that I knew that was ridiculous. But, the sounds of music and cars playing and things like that, I didn't realize there were communities in which it just became quiet. Because basically, in Hampton, the city closes down by 7:30, 8 o'clock. That was it. And our campus mirrored the culture of the city that it was in. And so unless it was Friday or we were doing a party or it was homecoming, something like that, it was pretty much quiet by 8:30, 9 o'clock. On the campus, it was very quiet, subdued. And I found that to be very serene for me. I was like, wait a minute, this is an option, right?
Was it a hard adjustment or was that an easy adjustment for you?
I don't know that I even thought that it was an adjustment. I just eventually realized. Now, I think that the adjustment was, I don't know if I want to call it that. I think, I would say the adjustment in terms of expectation. So not only was it quiet, things are there, things were clean. And so a lot of our urban centers have this sense of grit that's associated with the level of grunge to it. So you think of New York, it's the rats and things like that, but it's New York is where if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, but I don't want that. right? I don't want to be walking up and down the street and see, big giant rats and stuff like that. Like, I don't want to deal with that. And so
The
it wasn't like
stench of urine.
yes, just like everywhere. And so I was like, when I was at Hampton, I was like, wow, like things are really clean. It's like, so when I got back home, I started to evaluate like the party stores, convenience stores, the quality of the grocery stores. It really became clear to me like, oh, no, 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 no. I'm not getting treated at a level that I expect to be and should be. And so that was a big eye opener coming back from school, even the very first semester.
So did it change your expectations of what you felt like you needed out of your life in the long term and where you wanted to be or where you wanted to plant roots?
Younger, I thought I could change the environment where I was, but I quickly learned I was outnumbered by people who did not have the same perspective.
Say more about that. Are you thinking about just the community not having collective goals?
Not having similar goals. So the longer a person is in formal school, the more they become accultured to middle and upper class American values. Because the longer you're in school, those people who stay are dominated by those who are coming from those families. It's a very small percentage of people who are like first-time college goer who actually finish. And so by the time you get to the top and it's time to graduate, this has become your new friend group. And so you start to adopt some of the values and perspectives and things. And all of it isn't bad, but it's like, oh, wait a minute. I didn't know that it's okay to plan and have vacations. And, people have brand new cars. Like that wasn't a big thing. Like people just bought used cars a lot when I was growing up. It's like, you got a brand new car. Like, man, y'all must be rich. But which is a sidebar I'll come back to. But I think, so that's what I think the difference was, is that I wanted to create a community where we had an organized block club where people could come together and talk. But what happened, the community had become much younger. And because of the limited resources that were available to who was there, they didn't have a bandwidth to have those conversations. People need to be available for it. And it was too many who just weren't available. And so it became more of either I was going to have to do it all myself or I was going to become a nuisance. And so I said, well, I need to try and get myself to a place where it could be a greater shared environment.
So I want to talk a little bit about our current political system that we're in, or I should say our current political environment with the current administration that we have federally. And there's been conversation specifically around the possibility that the current administration could cut or roll back programs and funding around the Department of Education. Wanting to know your thoughts on what that could possibly look like, what type of detriment that puts urban schools in, schools that you work to help turn around, what happens if a bulk of this federal funding is lost, and then what as a community we can do to help, I don't know if it's alleviate or really just try to change course on how we think about educating our own. So it's a large question that we can sort of break up, but just thoughts around, do you think it'll actually happen that federal cuts will happen with the Department of Education, or it'll be, at some conversations have even been that it could be abolished altogether and we wouldn't even have a Department of Education?
Yeah, I definitely think there are going to be massive cuts, which I've been thinking about this a lot. I think particularly in the Black community, there are visceral reactions to President Trump. The first time, I think I was shocked that he won. I really just did not think that he would win. And so I guess I was caught off guard the first time. But this time, not so much, particularly with how it all unfolded. Like, it was an absolute long shot for us to try and get a very qualified candidate in. But in 90 days, that was tough to pull off. So, but having him in this time, I'm really watching. And so when it comes to education, I'm a big person. So in order to turn schools around, you got to have a perspective to push against the regime, because schools that are low performing because the system that they're in accepts the conditions that they produce. And so someone in that system has to make a decision to say, where we are centrally is going to change to ensure that the output changes in these schools that are low performing. Or they happen to hire a person who they think is a good cultural fit for that school, and all of a sudden that person basically turns into Superman, right? They begin to start pushing against the grain to produce things at the school that no one thought could be done, and it starts to make the system hemorrhage. Those people have short shelf lives, because in order to operate that way, you basically become a vigilante, because you're operating in a way that people who are in the system, you're forcing them to do things that aren't in their job description and their supervisor hasn't directed them to do. So unless they have some moral desire, they see those kinds of behaviors as antagonistic. So with that being said, there are some internal reflections that schools need to do. There's some accountability that I think the schools need to have. And so when you think about Ruby Bridges, Little Rock Nine, all of our historic figures who were a part of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which now overruled the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that separate can be equal, then said separate is not equal, right? Separate is no longer equal. And so what happened was we were not clear enough that when that Brown versus Board of Education decision was enacted, yeah, we'll let your kids come to school. But what we did not do was peel back the layers of all of those things. One, it wasn't necessarily going to school with white kids was what Black kids needed. Black kids needed access to current information, right? So that they could then be able to be competitive for jobs and things like that were happening. But what people don't discuss is what happened to the Black teachers and the Black principals and the Black superintendents in those Black communities. And so what happened to them was, at that time, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, policymakers went on an all-out assault. They then said, oh, if you all can integrate here, we can integrate into your schools. And so what they did was strategically placed inadequate administrators, teachers into the schools where the Black kids who by choice didn't want to integrate, they placed them there. And that's actually what started these lower performing schools. And so there's research around the effectiveness of Black principals and superintendents and teachers that were actually outperforming their white counterpart schools. And the white schools knew that those folk were high performing and actually collaborated with them on strategy. And so if those things were to be true, we have to do a better job of learning our lesson around legislation, right? And the shortcomings of legislation. So that's one. So then we fast track, right? Okay, so if we know that to be true, and we're like, oh, okay, there's going to be money that's going to be missing. Yeah, money's going to become missing. In 2020, when we knew when a decision was going to be made that schools were going to close pretty much for the remainder of the year, the very first thing, not only educators, but every person was like, oh my God, what is going to happen to our kids? We're going to have kids that don't know how to see, right? It's just going to be so bad. They're not even going to know how to walk. It's so bad. As if all of these educators were so dramatically transformational. I was like, wow, we're getting a lot of credit, right, for the work that we do. And so the federal government said, you know what, we agree. And so then what did they do? They then turned around and created funding for the elementary and secondary school emergency relief fund, which is what we call Esser. Separate from school budgets, the Esser funding was approved to be distributed to all the states, $190 billion. This is just 2020, to be completely obligated over 4 budget cycles. September of 2020 4, all funds needed to be obligated. After cycle 1, less than 25% of funds have been obligated. After cycle 1, less than 20% of the funds have been obligated. Now, that's what I'm saying. But people are complaining about, hey, what's going on? This is very recent. Like, only 20% of funds have been obligated. And guess why? Oh, because of administrative hurdles. That's not somebody else. Like, you got the money. The money is sent there. It's sitting there. Limited planning capacity. So you don't even have the time to spend the money that you got. And vendor shortages. I said to myself, this is synonymous, and I'm about to date myself, with Brewster's Millions, right? This is the old movie with Richard Pryor, where he got 30 days to spend his unknowingly wealthy uncle's money in order to get a bigger pot. And what he started to do was eventually make more money because he couldn't spend it all. But there's no one jumping up in arms around that. And so we don't have the latest results around which districts hadn't. But I can tell you for a fact, in the fall of 23, with less than 12 months before a 100% obligation, there were over 60% of states who were still less than 60% obligated.
So I want to stop you right there so that I can make sure that we understand what you're saying. What I'm hearing is that this money that was allocated to go into these school districts, that the money was moved, but the school districts themselves didn't have the capacity or the time to plan out what to do with the money and then implement the programming needed to then spend said money.
Yep, that's what they're saying. But what I'm saying is those are ridiculous excuses. And this is an indictment to our profession. And a mentor of mine shared this. He says, the problem with being a government employee is that you make mistakes that impact profit, but you don't have to deal with the consequences because in another year, you're just going to get replenished. It's like, that's not how it works in the private sector. Like, you have to be, you have to have a level of integrity and diligence about that. Or if you have a shortfall, you're going to face the consequences. People have to get laid off. Like, there are significant adjustments that need to get made. And that doesn't typically happen inside schools. And so this is actually some of the things that the president is saying. He's just masking it around DEI because it's a provocative thing to say. But he hasn't said this, and he would be 1,000% right if he just targeted Esser funds. What did you do with the almost $200 billion you just got 4 years ago? But to the point around why they aren't spending, we have to be better. It goes to what I was saying earlier around, I always believe that kids deserve experiences. And, but in order for me to think big for them, I have to think big for myself. And I have to talk to different people. I have to read things and figure out. Like, the EF Tours manual didn't come to me out of nowhere. I was looking up experiences for kids, different field trips for kids. And so when I was Googling, it happened to pop up. And so, back then, it was a long time ago, you had to send in a request to get the manual. And so they started mailing me brochures. And so that's an example. And so I can't think of anything from any district that is demonstratively better after receiving the funds that they've gotten from Esser. And so if that's a fact, we got to address that there was $200 billion on the table before we get to anything that the new president is bringing up, because you actually shouldn't have any issues with money. If you just got that, because ultimately the money that most districts got was almost the equivalent to 1.5 times their operating budget over the course of 4 years. So you got to think, you just got an influx of an additional 1.5 times your budget. What?
I have a lot of questions that's going through my head now, because the first question I have is, why weren't there some automatic raises for teachers? Because we know teachers are underpaid, and that's a big issue with retention. And then in recruitment is people don't want to teach because it's low paying, or they don't stay in teaching because it's underpaid. So that's one. But then it also makes me think about, what do we as community members, as parents, as just concerned citizens, who do we ask the questions to find out where the money is in our community and what did they do with it? Is it still there? And is that a school board question, or is that a state school board question, or is it a legislature question? How do we try to hold whomever we need to hold accountable?
Yeah, so it's going to be all three. I always suggest you start with your local first, and it's going to be that local school board. They're going to know because they were obligated to report out on exactly what they were spending and what they were spending it on, because there were certain categories for allowable usage. So to the point around teacher raises, that's where things got complicated because it's a temporary funding source. And so if you made a permanent decision and you raised that, where's the funding going to come from? Because, the longer term issue is not just the salary, it's the retirement. What goes into retirement and what you're going to be paying long term. How do you sustain that influx of deposits? And so most people tried to stay away from that. Now, what they did do was stipend teachers, right? Over the period of time, like, hey, we know you got a lot to do in terms of COVID mitigation. And so we will provide some stipends. So there were lots of districts who operated creatively there. So, but to me, I was just shocked at the low level of creativity. You had a lot of districts who did infrastructure upgrades, which I think was okay, but I didn't see anything creative around, hey, we have this opportunity. We want to create a focus group around how to address challenges that are triggering, like school shootings. We want to collectively invest and figure out what does the research say we can and should be doing as it relates to this? And so when you think about it now, districts invested in technology so that kids could have devices. Less than 30% of those same districts utilize those platforms to advance any level of teaching. They have all gradually moved back to what was happening before, as if before COVID was so dramatically better. And so that's the thing. I'm like, we have this selective amnesia. We're trying to just be prisoners of the moment. No. We had issues before. So, because you said, how did I get into turnaround? Remember, I said turnaround came about with No Child Left Behind legislation. Why would they need legislation to rank schools top to bottom if bottom was more relative? And so if we're talking 25 years ago with No Child Left Behind, that means that there were schools that were underperforming because they provided school improvement grant funding, SIG, which is what I was getting as that school leader. So we've been talking about lower performing schools and schools struggling for a long time. And so that's really what the president is talking about. It's like, look, we just show up the lowest on the TIM study out of the 40 ranked countries. We show up 40th, and then show up number one in expenditures for education. And so his thing is, help me make it make sense. Now, the approach that he's taking to it, yeah, I would have to beg to differ. But here's the thing. Who gets to leverage the consequence to come to them when they don't do what they were supposed to do? It doesn't work like that. And so I think people are spending too much time being emotional about the messenger and not staying focused on the message. And the other thing that I say is this. People who can demonstrate success in what they do never have to worry about being reduced. LeBron not worried about the trade deadline. He's looking at the ticker at his house. He's not worried about putting his house on the market. Now, if you that 6th, 7th, 8th man, stay nimble, right?
So this feels to me like a question of, are you in charge of your own destiny and how much control you have over your own upward mobility or whatever that looks like? Right. And being LeBron, having the skills that you have and proving your point over and over again, you have less to worry about because I said what I said, basically, and they're going to follow suit. So then how does that work in school? Thinking about, like, what's the big strategic plan? Like, you run a business, I run a nonprofit, and, bottom line is you always need a strategic plan, right? You need to be thinking about, what does the next 5 years look like? What does the next 10 years look like? And you need the time and the space to sit down and do that. ask the appropriate questions, figure it out, put a big budget together. You can have your pie in the sky budget, and then you might have one that is a little bit more conservative, depending on what's going to happen. But you want to be prepared for whatever comes in. And to me, what it sounds like is that we live in a country where school systems don't have the space to plan and be prepared for the what if. What if somebody gave us $10 million? What will we do with it? And then you're like, oh, well, I don't know. And then it just sits there. Whereas, you know what? I've got a laundry list of things in which I would do and in this order. So if the money comes in, I can spend it and show improvement and then show how I need more. So how do we do that as a collective, as a whole?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is to not be a prisoner of the moment and to learn from the past. And so one of the things that popped up when you were talking, Mark Zuckerberg in, I believe it was somewhere between 2010 and 2012, gave somewhere between 10 and 100 million. I don't want to be off, but he gave a sizable amount of money to Newark public schools for transformation. Nobody's heard about what's happened there. For that amount of money, it should have been Pulitzer Prize kinds of things that are happening. In 2012, Shelby County in Tennessee, Memphis Public Schools went bankrupt. There's a clause in their charter for the school district that if they were to go bankrupt and not be able to run, that the county had to absorb them, Shelby County, which is much more conservative than the city of Memphis. And so obviously that created some political unrest. The Gates Foundation stepped in and said, we got 100 million. We'll help with this transition. What have you heard about Shelby County or Memphis? Nothing. Now, one of the things that I do think, though, has been beneficial, I'm going to go here and then I'm going to go back to come back forward, was after Katrina. After Katrina, the response to bring back the schools in New Orleans was called the Recovery School District, RSD. And so what they did was, it wasn't just non-educators displaced, they were also residents. And so when everyone was displaced, in order to come back, they said, we're going to incentivize our educators to return through being able to open up charter schools. They'll open up charter schools and we will operate our school differently. So there's a ton of research that came from a department out of the University of Washington. It's called CERPI, the Center for Reinventing Public Education. And so what they said was, we're going to open up these schools as like a portfolio district. The schools will have full autonomy. We're going to give them more money because we're not going to open up an academic office. So we're not going to give them curriculum. They're going to build that themselves. We're going to give that money to them. We're just going to serve as a governing body of accountability, that if you open up a school, we're going to have you do certain metrics. And so that was probably one of the most profoundly innovative public education innovations that we've seen that doesn't get discussed as much, but people do know about that. They just don't know the details. The other thing that I'll say is, to me, innovation comes from a time in which there's a need and an ability for someone to want to create a prototype to address the need. And, in the response to Rosa Parks, the folk in Birmingham were like, yo, we sick of this treatment, but Rosa Parks represented the straw that broke the camel's back, right? These are things that are happening over and over. And she now represents just the culture that exists that we're sick and tired of. And so the response was to say, until we get on there, we're going to refuse all of us from getting on that bus. And so the Birmingham bus boycott lasted over a year. That was the beginning or the prototype of Uber. Being able almost 75 years ago to create that, we have to tap back into that part of us, that let's be uncomfortable as we prototype, because so many times what we want to do is we want to exercise and feel the fruits of success of organizations that have been through all the iterations and struggles. Like, oh, now we love Amazon. Nobody was talking about Amazon in 1999 when he was sitting in some box looking crazy, losing money over and over. And so that's what we have to do, is be willing to deal with some of those early iterations of ideation to get to a place where we can start to get new streams of revenue, but also new outcomes. And so I was talking to a good friend of mine today. He said, look, so I was writing this down. We were talking. He said, there are certifications that exist in my company or Fortune 500 companies that exist in our company that we hire for that are close to six figures that don't require college diplomas. And it's cybersecurity, Security Plus, Network Plus, and he said CEH, Certified Ethical Hacker. I was like, I ain't never in my life heard of these certifications. And so to the point,
me neither.
And so to the point that I'm making, right, we have to do a better job of interacting with employers around what things they need versus trying to assume what we think. Because educators are really like still talking about agrarian societal kinds of expectations and not what's current. Because if more college kids knew I could get close to six figures and not have to pay, 35 to 40,000 a year to go to some school, you got me locked in. And so that's what I would say. I think that that's where we got to have more conversations like this and raise the questions that you're raising so that people can even know and give themselves license to think this way. Because so much of it is like a crabs in a barrel. Let me piggyback off of what the other person is doing so I don't become seen as steering from the fray or not sticking with the flock, right? That's why you got all of these schools with almost $200 billion who basically all did the same thing, brought in new chairs and painted their halls. What was the
that doing?
Yeah, you could have been ideating and creating some things and paying some of the smartest people with that money. You could have brought MIT people in to do fellowships. You could have brought people from all walks of life to come in and help reimagine your district.
Why is there not enough room for experimentation? Is it that people are afraid of it, or is it just because it hasn't been done before or it hasn't been done enough that people feel comfortable doing something else? Or is it a scarcity mindset of, well, we don't have enough money to do this, or we don't have enough this or that, or resources to do whatever it is that someone might want to dream about, so then they stay stuck in a box?
Yeah, I think there are a few things with that, Erika. I think that there are levels to schools. So public education has its own frame of thought, but then you have private schools and boarding schools. Elite private boarding schools, they don't see themselves as K-12 schools. They see the way in which things are happening there as elite learning institutions. They don't see themselves as like a school. Right? To be here, we want to see how you contribute to the community. We want to be intentional about how you spend time. Almost every single boarding school, high caliber private school provides a semester or at least a quarter of kids' senior years where they do independent study in high school. Right? Where they go out and think deeply around some topic that they think is important. And many kids do very creative things. They might live in Michigan and say, hey, I want to do this thing. And they might go and spend 2 or 3 months in Hollywood, right? Or they might go down to Atlanta and do some creative things down there in the movie industry that's happening there. Or they might spend time in this, organization with doing cybersecurity as a high schooler. And so they think deeply about their schools and they reach out to people in different industries because they always want to stay cutting edge so that they invite kids who want to be cutting edge. And so if you think about what I was saying also with the school, by the time we started with this trip to Paris, it started to create a culture where it didn't matter what walk of life you were in. If you wanted it, it could become available for you. And so now it was like this public school with private school amenities. And so when people feel like they're actually getting something for what they're putting in, they got skin in the game now. And so I'm willing to make myself more reserved, be much more conscious about how I show up because there's something in this for me. And so that was something that creating those opportunities created, to me, a true ingredient to school transformation and not just turnaround. It was like, we're transforming how we have this experience, because you got to make these experiences meaningful to what's happening inside the class. And so what we encourage was like, look, every teacher, you should have some kind of club or competitive thing that you're doing. If you're a history teacher, you should do a geography bee, English teacher, spelling bee, and push kids to become Scripps Howard kids. So a good friend of mine, I was telling him about that. He said, I was a finalist in the state of Ohio to be a Scripps Howard when I was in the 8th grade. And he said, and I forgot the word. He remembers the word to this day that he missed out on.
This is the spelling bee.
Yep. And so I did some research on them. Kids who are Scripps Howard spelling bee students usually end up performing in the top 10% of earners in the country.
Because they can spell well?
I don't know what it was, but they just did a longitudinal study around what do they become later in life. But if you think about just their understanding of language overall, like the roots of languages and like where those things come from at such an early age, that means they've learned that, and the number of words that they now know by the time they get out of 8th grade. So, they know how to write. They definitely know how to spell. They understand most languages. So they probably have almost began to open themselves up to being, fluent in multiple languages if they try, because of their study of etymology. So it's that kind of stuff that I think is missing. We're not just educators aren't giving themselves license to think deeply and to think creatively because they aren't seeing other people do it. And so that's what we're trying to do, is to help push them to think that way.
And I think that that's really important. What that brings up for me then is like state testing, because educators also, from my vantage point, I feel like they are almost caged in on what they're even able to think about doing or wanting to do. A lot of folks might have some brilliant ideas on how to teach children or how to show them a different pathway, or realize that we all don't learn the same, and that they need adjustments, whether it's auditory or vision or whatever that is. But these tests that are required at certain grade levels sort of box people in. Thinking about current state testing, how is that a part of the problem? Or do you see that as being a part of the problem, that we don't have this space and this privilege to be innovative in that way to change the course of public education?
Yeah, I think testing is a characteristic of evaluation, because I think even more detrimental than testing is grading, because grading has such dramatic disparities, not only between schools, but between classrooms within a school. So many times you could do a mystery shopper kind of experience and ask each teacher how they come up with the grades for their students. And many of them will have very different answers. That is a systemic structural error. That should not be the case. It should be very consistent throughout, which is what you see in colleges, where you have a syllabus, right? This is what we're going to do. This is what you're expected to. And that's like a binding contract, right, between you and that professor, so that you can kind of like project out what you're doing. And so I think the tests are an indicator or a strategy for people to say, hey, look, how are we going to measure what schools are doing? So honestly, that's also what Trump is trying to experiment with, that you've been doing that and tell me how it's worked, that you've been talking about paying all of this money to people who are making these tests, to all of these states around doing these tests, and we're the bottom 40 now. And so that's where it's like you are giving him the ammunition to fire on you. But if you think about it, once again, they don't take standardized tests in private and elite boarding schools, but yet those kids end up in some of the most elite colleges. So to your point, that's the difference, is that I'm giving free game now. So a parent can opt out of that test. Mm-hmm. Schools will never tell you that, because they need 95% of their enrolled population in order to get credit for that test. So they would never say that. But a parent can say, I don't want my kid to be tested, and opt out of it. And they don't have to take the test.
How does that affect the child?
It doesn't. Doesn't, because you can't. Because ultimately the test is really not for the kid. It's really about the school. Because any person in their right mind would never spend 8 to 12 hours testing an 8-year-old. You got an 8-year-old taking a high stakes test. It takes longer to take that test for an 8-year-old than it takes the LSAT to become a lawyer. And so some stuff, it doesn't make sense. But people are unwilling to push against it. But if the president gets what he wants and eliminates the department, it will become a state issue. The states will dictate how they want to see their departments of education function.
Do you think that if that happens, that from what I understand in how you're saying it, that it could be detrimental, but it could also be a pathway to changing how we do things, and it could ultimately be for the better?
Yeah, no question about it. So I think that most people hate change. Most people hate change that they feel like they don't have control over. And I think that's what raises the anxiety for people. And so I think when we match that with our political environment, you have polarizing parties who are unwilling to give any credit to the other one for anything. And so we have to come together. And so, what I do is just try and tune out. I'll listen for a little bit. When I find myself trying to become a pundit, I'm like, see, you're doing too much. Pull back, you know what I'm saying? And give yourself a break. And the strategy that I also use is stay tuned in for what matters to you, right? Like what is really impacting what you're doing day to day, and try to really focus on that. Because what's happening is it's like a 3-card Monty that I'm gonna give you so much so I can disorient you. Because the person who does that 3-card Monty, they start out slow. So you can see it. You I told you I could get it. And then they get you to gamble enough and go so fast that when you open it up, you're tricked. That's the same thing that's happening now. It's so many executive orders. There's so many tariffs that we're getting disoriented. And so you don't even remember why or what you were supposed to be paying attention to. And by the time you get it all figured out, it's all happened to you, versus really trying to focus in on what matters most and just let the rest of that stuff go by.
So if it comes down to becoming a state issue and states having control of their education systems, what policy do you think, or policies do you think, will help guide a state to fix their low-performing public school system?
I don't know that they would unless someone made them, because I don't think that that's really a desire. So, for example, you'll hear mayoral candidates talk about public education, but there are very few school districts that are under mayoral control. Mm-hmm. DC is one of them, but they don't want to deal with that headache because it's too complicated. And there's really no win for them. Where's the win in this? Especially in these large urban districts, it's how's that going to happen? So what I think is that initially you will see polarizing strategies based upon political parties by governors. But again, Texas and Massachusetts, to me, become ground zero to study because they've always done what they wanted, no matter what president was in there. When Common Core was coming across, they were like, we're not doing it. They're like, all right, well, we'll take funding. They're like, keep the money. We're not doing it. We got our own stuff in place. And I will be very honest, Texas has a very strong, organized system for education. Is it the best? All of that kind of stuff. It's the best organization for the size of the state that they have, right? It's a big, gigantic piece of this country. So there are things that can be studied there to see how things can operate. Now, where I think the challenge comes is that the big issue is Title I funding. And so what they're saying is that title money will then go to the states as a block grant. The question becomes, will those governors disperse the same funding amounts to all schools and honor those prior allocations? That's the question, because it's now up to them how they decide to do that.
And then it becomes partisan, or could become partisan.
Yes. But that's where I think people begin to allow fear to overwhelm them. Here's the thing. Do well. Don't worry about anything else. Do your job really, really well and teach kids at a high level. You won't have to worry about funding because it'll be coming out of the sky to you. Only the people who are in the back are worrying about if they're going to get a participation medal. Because if you come in first, you know you're getting the medal. And so, but too many schools are always worried about who's getting this raise. If we all make sure kids learn, everybody's getting a raise. It's going to be money falling out of the sky. And so that's one of the messages is like, don't get yourself so distracted with this other nonsense. Stay focused on the main thing.
That makes a lot of sense. So before we go, I want to make sure that folks know about the Simmons Advantage and what you all do. We talked a lot about education and what school districts and schools need to do. Is that what the Simmons Advantage does for schools, or how would you describe your work? And if an administrator was interested in your services, what would they be looking to get?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the client who best fits with the work that we do are school districts who are looking to implement or adjust some large scale initiative, which will fall under our organizational change reimagined category. School districts that are thinking about the retention of their principals, because most large urban school districts turn over 25% or more of their principals. And so in any other industry, there would be zero chance that that business will be profitable with that percentage of executive leaders turning over each year. And so many times they don't realize that that's happening. Again, a consequence of being able to get that same funding year after year. I think that people would do things differently. But that manifests itself in executive coaching, aspiring leaders academies, thought partnership. And then the last is our most vulnerable population. We provide support and structures for special education students. And so helping districts think about how they identify and if they're doing that in the best ways that's supportive to the student, and how they develop the IEP. Is the IEP developed to actually help the kid become skillful and within range of their grade level peers? And then we also help to implement the IEP, create the structure so that all teachers understand what's on that student's IEP so that they implement it in a way that the kid is learning no matter what class or what teacher they see. And a big feature to support that has to do with our workforce development for high school kids with special needs. And that we provide soft skills support, and then our hard skills is done through our work-based learning. That high school kids get an opportunity to participate in paid work experiences in very diverse industries that supports their skill level. And usually for many of them, this is the first time that they've ever worked. And so again, like I was sharing earlier, the opportunity to get exposure, the opportunity to have families see a kid that they thought would be with them forever, and we've worked with them and we encourage them. And now they're out, not only are they working, but they're earning their own wage. Like families every year are so outdone with what their children are capable of doing, only because we believed in their wildest dreams. And so that's the work that we do. And anyone that is interested in that kind of support and structure will be great fits for the work that we do.
That sounds amazing. And, that makes me think about my own, I always keep wanting to say my own child, but it's so weird to call your kid a child when they are 25. But my own young adult, her journey in teaching and her aspiration to work with more kids who are learning disabled, and specifically autism is where she has taken a real interest in and just has a real knack for it, and has since she was in high school. And so wanting to use dance and other things to help them communicate, the younger kids, and then help them adjust. And she's really patient with that. And to have those opportunities, I think it's such a gift it's a gift. She feels a gift for doing it, but also there's a gift for parents that someone is taking that time so that their kid gets the resources and the attention that they need so that they can live their life to the fullest and they're not pushed off to the side because they can't keep up in this mainstream class. And there's so many kids, I think back to when I was in school, who couldn't keep up in different ways. And we didn't have all these different diagnoses. And I wonder how much better their lives could have been in class if there was more room for in ways in which to learn and more support for the teachers to have in the classroom for folks who just needed a different way to look at things.
That's right. 1,000%.
So I really appreciate you. And I really, really, really appreciate this conversation. Like, I could ask you 15 more questions, but we are way over time. And I got to
do it again.
We do have to do it again, but I do want to make sure we congratulate y'all on the 9th year of Simmons Advantage. Yes. It's a hard thing to do, to plant a seed for a dream, to do something and to start and own and operate a business and then go out and convince others that they need the services that you are offering and then show up and do it on a regular basis. Like, the follow through of entrepreneurship that people don't talk about is a hurdle that most folks can't overcome. And y'all have done it. Y'all are continuing to do it. And I'm glad to know y'all.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, we tried.
Yes, you're doing more than try. Y'all out here. Y'all out here.
Yeah, we, like the kids be saying, we outside.
Right. So this has been another episode of Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington with my special guest, Kwame Simmons. And we'll see y'all next week.
Thanks for listening to Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington. Hosted and executively produced by Erika Washington. With editing by Black Gypsy LLC and Simone Endress. Special thanks to KUNV 91.5 in Las Vegas. This show is powered by Make It Work Nevada, a project of Tides Advocacy. And a special thank you to Grove GT Teague and Eno Savad, who made our new theme song, Way Below Acceptable.